Charles Bukowski once said in an interview that love is like a morning fog. As awe-inspiring as it looks, it evaporates as it comes into contact with the first rays of the morning sun. In the same manner, love's magnificence vanishes quickly when it is exposed to reality. Mark and Anne's relationship went through the exact same phases. First came the time of admiration, appreciation, marriage, and honeymoon, but soon the picture of a happy couple changed as both began to gradually shift away from each other. Phones, journals, parties, and computers become a way to avoid having a real conversation, and soon the connection is lost. The love of the past dusts away, and in comes a time of jealousy, cheating, and unhappiness. And finally, everything leads to the moment when Mark enters an enormous library, approaches his friends Pierre and Kathy, and breaks the gloomy news to them: he is getting a divorce tomorrow. Kathy stands up and gives him a hug. She empathizes with him a little too much, though, until Pierre feels an urge to stand up too and stop this scene. They represent a free-spirited couple that somehow manages to work perfectly. Seeing them walk in front of him makes Mark hate love even more. The place where people get divorce documents signed is quite a sight. Mark is convinced that people who get married should at least once have a peek inside a place like this. It will surely make them reconsider their decision. The divorce ceremony is the comical opposite of its divine counterpart, marriage. We learn here that it wasn't Mark's idea to get divorced. There is no wonder he is about to say goodbye to 60,000 euros and hate Anne forever. It is quite a shame that the love we saw in the first scenes is about to end in this down-to-earth way. His life now consists of two main parts: literary criticism and nightlife. And naturally, after experiencing the stinging slap in the face of love, he is eager to immerse himself in the second one. He is told by his friend behind the bar that Anne is already passing some time with another man in the toilet as they speak. And Mark, having 3 shorts in front of him, to put his racing and loathing mind to sleep, gives a toast to the hate of love. There is no happiness or love. All that exists is the brain damage that comes from believing in fairy tales. The pictures of love on the internet were painful that night. His mind is racing with bitter thoughts, and he chugs down a few more shots to gather up all his courage for doing one last thing. Over the sound of the most romantic music, he intends to put an end to his purposeless suffering. The ties he uses for that endeavor, however, prove to be weaker than his drunken mind had thought, so the next morning, he is woken up by his vacuum cleaner robot, and life continues as if nothing happened last night. The way Mark brushes off yesterday's painful decisions is surprisingly simplistic. He realizes that his life could still have an aim in it, a meaning. He must convey to other people too that the myth of love is a mere mother farce, and in this way, help others avoid pain. Besides, he's really pissed off at love and wants to get back to it and return a heavy blow, so he starts writing a book. Chapter after chapter, he attempts to rigorously explain why love poses stupid promises, and, in the process of this clever deceiving, destroys people's lives. Gradually, as the process of writing moves forward, his appearance changes too. In short, he gives his entire life to this one purpose, and after finishing the manuscript, he calls his friend Jean George. He parties extremely hard that night and gets to endure the painful hangover in his own urine the next morning. His TV is on, and a man his ex-wife is with right now appears on the screen. Mark Levy is an awfully successful man. To Mark, this is a spit in the face from life. After putting all of his energy into writing a hateful book about love, he realizes that he's even more miserable than before. He explodes in anger, and the TV and his own foot have to pay the price. Somebody visits him then. Alice is another major character in our story. Mark seems particularly pleased with this surprise. He turns to us then and says that his divorce is partly because of her. To see what exactly he means, we go back in time now and arrive at the funeral of Mark's grandmother. His mother is standing next to him as he tries his best to sing alone to the chant. His father arrives too, and we see him as he makes his way together with a very young and attractive woman named Julia. It is obvious that Mark's parents are divorced, and what mostly constitutes their relationship now are witty interests. Julia is dressed all in white, and this is the reason for their first silent argument. The padre engages in a lengthy discourse in Latin. His speech is so pretentious that Mark would give anything to be able to perish laughing here. And now, but thankfully, his manners are too strong to let him do that. Suddenly, however, he hears a guffaw coming from the other row. It is Alice, who seems to be unable to help but laugh in the face of this pretentiousness. Mark doesn't know her yet, but clearly, the first impression she makes on him is positive. Outside, the two of them meet each other for the first time. Alice turns out to be the wife of Mark's cousin, Antoine. Facing this woman, he seems not to care at all about the grieving attitude of everyone around him. Their following conversation is extremely inappropriate for the occasion. Alice notices that Mark struggles with controlling his eyes, so she helps him out and tells him that she has uneven breasts. Alice meets Jean George too, the person who only knows Mark from the family. Alice and he both notice the change in Mark's behavior that afternoon. He has become more confused and awkward, like a teenager. He and Jean George talk about Alice then. It is clear that the latter has already caught the growing passion in Mark's gaze, so he promises not to try and seduce her. Shortly after, the present Mark himself narrates the mistakes he made that day. Firstly, we see him poorly choosing too romantic a song to listen to in front of a dazzling backdrop. The hope of grasping love's sweetest feeling creeps up on him there, and so, when Alice joins him, he's in the most vulnerable emotional and mental state. He commits his second mistake here, giving his earphones to Alice. This music serves as the source of their subjects for conversation, and Mark finds himself more and more impressed with this woman. She even cries when watching the magic donkey. Mark has never met anyone who would say that. The sight of the blue sea catches Alice's attention, and feeling inspired, she goes for a swim. The fact that the funeral is being held behind her back means nothing to her, and this small decision speaks a lot about her character. Naturally, Mark follows her. After descending a steady slope, they get into a boat and continue their conversation there. Mark starts talking about his childhood memories that are connected to this place. Alice looks him in the eyes afterwards and asks him a sudden question. She wants to know where his wife is. The conversation resumes naturally after Mark answers her question, until a surfer girl comes out of the water, asking them if they're lovers. The couple denies it cheerfully, and shortly after, both Mark and the surfer girl watch as Alice undresses in front of them and gives herself to the waves. Awkwardly, Mark addresses the little girl then. But before he's even able to begin asking his question, he receives the answer to it. There is only one reason why Alice would undress in front of him. And so, Mark makes his third mistake in this moment. He believes this little kid. Now we are transported back in time and hear about the purpose of Alice's visit. She wants Mark to stop sending her his address and code. Naturally, she didn't have to come all the way to convey this simple information to him, so Mark playfully invited her inside. The place is a complete mess, and he is in a terribly unpresentable condition, but Alice acts coolly. She sees that Mark's foot is broken, and the two go to the hospital to have it checked. She turns out to be a terrible driver. Throughout the entire drive, Marcus fears for his life as his hangover gets worse and worse. Suddenly, he feels like he'll vomit again, and since the way she drives isn't of any help, he lets it all out on the carpet. Screaming, Alice stops the car, and both step out to empty their stomachs. Compared to their initial romantic meeting, this is what one might call an extremely down-to-earth life situation. After setting everything straight in the hospital, Alice says she has to go to her office now, and even though Mark begs her in a comically dramatic manner to forget everything about this morning, she says that there is no way that the association between the smell of vomit and Mark's face will ever be severed. Mark starts sending her messages after this episode and gets to know about a very fine detail of contemporary love life. Texting is a form of torture in today's dating culture. The more another person ignores you, the more you fall in love with them. Alice leaves his messages unanswered for 8 days. And so, imagine the state Mark must be in. In the next scene, he visits Pierre and Kathy. Here, he is stricken with enormous news. His friends are getting married, and Pierre even wants him to be his witness. Immediately, Mark gets upset and demands that he have a private meeting with him in the bathroom. There, as methodically as his anxiousness permits, Mark tries to change his mind. There is no need to throw yourself in the pit of marriage, where love decreases as time passes. Pierre doesn't seem to be convinced at all, however. He seems to be extremely confident about his relationship. He believes strongly that instead of dying out, love becomes stronger as time goes by. Finally, he manages to win the argument and convince his best friend that he is making the right decision. Later that day, he has a date with Alice. After arriving early in the restaurant, he imagines the various versions of Alice's entrance, and it keeps his mind occupied for quite some time. Her real entrance is completely different from the imaginative ones, though. The beginning of their conversation is also not what Mark expected. Openly, she says that coming here was probably a bad idea, but what she has to convey is better said in person. Even though the nature of their meeting might look seductive from Mark's perspective, there is no way Alice can think about hooking up with someone she vomited with. They will make perfect friends, though. In short, Alice is quite happy that, finally, there's a man in her life who could really become her true friend. This prospect sounds completely ridiculous to Mark, though, and so he just gets his act together and deletes her phone number in front of her. Alice, too, follows his lead, but says that she'll delete it afterwards. Still, they separate on quite a positive note. He meets with Pierre and Jean George then, and together they pass time by eating and guessing what kind of trimness passerby women have. After telling them what happened with Alice, Jean George tells him very strictly not to make the obvious mistake and call her. Naturally, Mark is very quick not to follow that clever advice. He invites Alice on a friendly walk in beautiful weather. Alice has a shooting, but she agrees to go. When Mark arrives at the site, Alice is working with the models, trying to explain to them how to kiss for the camera. After seeing Mark, to clearly demonstrate what she means, she gives him a long and passionate kiss. Mark is petrified, but he manages to at least somewhat read the situation and play it cool. He brushes his confusion off quickly and says that the models probably need to see it a second time. He pulls her closer to him, and even though Alice is somewhat reluctant this time, she fails to fight the passion off. 2 kisses aren't enough to extinguish the flames, however, so we see them in bed in the following scene. Mark is eager to know what Alice thinks about their future. He awaits positive answers and signs from her that she's willing to keep this relationship going and leave his man. But Alice keeps repeating that she doesn't know. There's one thing she knows perfectly well. However, once she becomes available, Marcus will lose interest. The latter must be aware of this too. That evening, he receives a letter from one of the publishers he sent his manuscript to, and the next day, she arrives for a meeting. Francesca Vernisi, the publisher, expresses the will to publish a briefly revised version of his book really soon. She comes out as the kind of publisher who won't give her authors a hard time. After a few minutes of discussion, she asks him about his desired pay. It is symbolic that Mark wants 60,000 euros for it, and of course, the publisher won't agree to pay that much. Vernisi also urges him to come up with a pseudonym. The critics know his name, and they will be eager to demolish his work without even reading it thoroughly. Mark manages to come up with it on the spot. He shall be published as Fedor Belvedere. He has Jean George and Pierre over at his apartment that night. Here, after learning that Mark intends to hide his publication from Alice, Pierre advises him not to make that mistake. It is true that Alice will probably change her mind about Mark after reading his book called Love Lasts 3 Years, but one way or another, she will inevitably find the truth, and then, on top of being misogynistic, Mark will come out as a liar. When Love Lasts 3 Years comes out, he and Alice go on a vacation, and thanks to their undying passion, they only go out once. Mark tries to tell her about the book as they walk near the sea, but instead all he ends up talking about is their future. He wants her to talk to her husband. He wants to settle down. Later that day, Mark sees an ad for his book in the window of a local bookshop and seizes the opportunity to ask Alice if she read it. Unfortunately for Mark, she has, and she hates it. Not knowing it's his book, she completely annihilates it. Amused, she listens as Mark tries to protect it and then says that he could not possibly appreciate the ridiculous, childish perspective this book has on love. Like a teenager, the author falsely believes that desire and love are the same thing. Naturally, Mark is in big trouble. In the next scene, Antoine comes home after work, holding flowers. He's clearly in a mood to celebrate something really important. Cheerfully, he greets his wife, but the latter is in a particularly sorrowful mood. After realizing that it is their 3-year anniversary, she breaks down in tears and finds herself unable to hide her affair. She goes to Mark then and, free from an enormous load, embraces him firmly. To celebrate, they go to a party that evening. They dance so freely and so passionately that even the owner of the club approaches them to give them a compliment. He goes too far, though, and the couple loses interest. Drunk, they pass the entire night in the streets, and at the break of dawn, they conclude their night by resting on a meadow. White rabbits hop around them as they admit to themselves and to each other that this is love. A big inconvenience follows this pleasant event, however. Mark's book proves to be a big hit, and since Mark is the only desirable living author of the publication, Vernisi decides to forget about the anonymity of Mark and announce a meeting with the author. Mark tries his best to explain to her why he cannot attend. His life is finally going great, and if Alice finds out he lied, he doesn't even want to think about the consequences. Vernisi, however, doesn't care about his personal life at all. Besides, she's offering 300,000 euros, so Mark is led to doubt his initial decision. In the next scene, while speaking with Jean George, he learns a bad secret from him. It seems Jean has an affair with Kathy, Pierre's future wife. And so, now Mark has 2 secrets he feels bad about. In the following scene, he wins a literature prize, and Vernisi goes up on stage to accept it on his behalf. She begins reading a letter there, and from Mark's expression, we understand that he wrote no letter. Vernisi is clearly trying to do something they have not agreed upon. She says that the author is in this room and looks directly into Mark's eyes. The latter is dumbfounded. Cameras begin to turn towards his face, and slowly, he is chased around the room as he tries to convince everybody that he is not the author. Unfortunately, everybody in the literary circle will soon know about his secret. Alice learns the secret from the TV, where running Mark is shown as he locks himself in a restroom. When he finally comes out, the building is empty. He cannot express his anger enough. Upon coming back home, he sees Alice packing up. Disappointed in him and with a broken heart, she has no intention to stay in this relationship. She has so much for it, and what she got in return was nothing but deception. And even though Mark tries his best to explain that he's changed after writing that book, before exiting through the door, she states clearly that this is the last time they are seeing each other. Mark goes to his father's house the next day and tells him and Yulia about the news. Here, for the first time, father and son have a decent conversation. Nothing productive comes out of it, though. The only emotion achieved is disgust and avoidance. The father talks so much about his sexual life and the divorce that Mark is led to literally run away. Mark signs some books in the next scene. To be more precise, it's his publisher that does all the work, while he just sits there, gloomily talking about his mischievous fate. After a few minutes, Vernisi has enough. She turns to him and tells him that instead of whining about his destiny, he should get his act together, stop crying, and start fighting for his love. The women in line laugh after this brief motivational outburst, and Mark is led to exit the bookstore awkwardly. That night, he tries to forget about his pain in various ways but realizes that no matter what, the pain intends to go nowhere. He calls Jean George then and suffers in front of him. Knowing that Jean George has never been in love, he envies him. But the latter puts a thought into his head then. It is Jean George who should envy Mark, not the other way around. He would give everything just to be able to experience what Mark is going through right now. The latter is at Pierre's wedding in the next scene. After Kathy's delightful and funny speech, Pierre makes a surprising announcement. He says that Kathy is pregnant. After a short applause, Mark stands up and asks for attention. Naturally, he has no intention to say anything in favor of love in this speech. Arrogantly, he breaks it to everyone that love cannot even last for a day, because in order for something to last, it first has to exist, and love is nothing but a fairy tale, an advertisement created to keep consumers happy. Towards the end of his talk, his statement becomes so insulting that Jean George has to drag him outside by force. In the dark blue light of dawn, he approaches Alice's house and demands that he be let inside. But the door remains closed while inside. The boring, soulless love life between Alice and Antoine continues. Even though he doesn't want to admit it, Mark writes a very conventional love letter to Alice. In the letter, he announces to her that every day at 7 p.m. he'll be waiting for her in the place where they first kissed each other. Starting from that moment, the letters start flowing in Alice's direction, and she comes up with a different method of destroying them every time. Still, we see her eyeing Mark from the distance as the latter sits on the bench, waiting for her to arrive. Mark appears in a talk show in the next scene, and instead of talking to the person across the table who's clearly eager to destroy his book on national television, he turns to the camera and starts talking to Alice. He knows that Alice takes him for a childish moron, but he truly believes now that love doesn't vanish as time passes by. To make his appearance even more comical, he quotes Shakespeare in English, but as cliché as it might seem, he truly comes out as a man in love. The book Love Lasts 3 Years is the cry of a man who hasn't met a person like her. After listening to this heartwarming and vulnerable speech, we see Alice running from home in search of him. When she finds him and embraces him, Mark is as petrified as he was when she first kissed him. But after this beautiful scene is played out before our eyes, we see that it was only happening in Mark's head. The next day, Vernesy praises his courage on TV and offers him an 18-month-long residency in Australia. In the next scene, we see what his decision is. In the conversation with Jean George, he says that he'll be leaving for Melbourne soon. This isn't good news for Jean at all. He's getting married soon too, and he wants Mark to be his witness too. After seeing what he did at Pierre's wedding as a witness, it is a sign of courage from Jean George. Naturally, Mark is eager to make him reconsider, but his attempt will prove futile in this instance too. Jean George finally felt something he had never felt before. It suddenly clicked inside of him, and he had no intention to let it slip away from his grasp. In the next scene, Jean George and his new partner further explain their situation. They are not gay. They are just tired of having relationships with women. It is a mutual decision and a kind of pure love they have never experienced before. Despite this conversation, Mark decides to jump into the pit of hedonism now. Meanwhile, Alice, whose cold love life is obviously ruining her life, sees an invitation to Jean George's wedding, and despite knowing that Mark is going to be there, decides to leave Antoine again. Time passes, and then we see Mark at the wedding. Knowing that soon he will leave these people behind, he sorrowfully walks among the cheerful crowd. He runs into Kathy and Pierre then. Kathy's baby is born. Particularly, he looks much more like Jean George than Pierre, but the latter is convinced that Kathy has a small amount of African American blood and there is nothing to be concerned about. The wedding ceremony for Jean George is the weirdest thing he has ever seen. After it is done, Mark grabs a microphone and announces that he has a surprise. He has brought Michel Legrand, the legendary composer, to perform at their wedding. And as the tunes begin to flow over the ocean, Alice arrives in a red dress. She looks over at the place from which Mark is sorrowfully listening to the song. Their eyes meet, and his face lights up with an expression of surprise. When they come together after a long time of being apart, the surfer kid who saw their first meeting comes up to them out of nowhere. After witnessing their initial connection in the boat, she thought they were in love, and now, as she sees their reunion, there is no doubt in her mind that it is true. We see them walking on the beach in the last scene, discussing their future, especially Mark's departure. They are both sure that there is nothing to worry about. Their love will prevail, and all that is left is happiness ever after. They kiss, and for a moment, everything disappears. Perhaps this is exactly why they fail to notice an enormous wave roaring its way towards the coastline.